All right, folks, and welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us once again for this next installation of the Summer STEM series provided to you by Create at UC San Diego. In this session today, we'll be talking about social consciousness in STEM. And really what that means is that we're going to be capturing panelist insights and perspectives on the different intersections between STEM and a lot of these social issues that we're currently faced with and that underrepresented minority students in STEM tend to face with and are challenged with as they continue to move forward in their persistence to acquire their degrees in STEM. So with us today, we were very fortunate to be accompanied by 5 wonderful panelists, beginning with Dr. Ebonee Williams from UC San Diego, where she is the Director of Virtual Experience and Peer Engagement Initiatives. Dr. Aj Hinton Jr., who is the Academic and Career Development Instructor at University of Iowa. Dr. George Boggs, President and CEO Emeritus of the American Association of Community Colleges and also former President of Palomar College here in San Diego. Valeria Guerrero, who's a graduate student in robotics and mechatronics at Santa Clara University, and Robin Lopez, who's a graduate student in environmental science, policy, and management at UC Berkeley. So we want to thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, folks, and lending yourself to a very genuine, very authentic conversation that we hope will continue to inspire and encourage folks to move forward in their education and to also realize that they're not alone in their challenges and that many of the experiences that they encounter have unfortunately been encountered before, and so they can take courage and continue to move forward. So thank you very much. The way I'd like to start off is by just going down the list of panelists here and asking you all to introduce yourselves if you would. I know we have your bio slides up here, but there's nothing like a personal introduction of folks and kind of just sharing what your story is. We'll take maybe about 3 to 5 minutes to share your story and let us know how it is that you got to where you're currently at. So if Dr. Williams, if you could start us off, that'd be great.
Yay, the hot seat. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm excited to be on the panel with such a great group of individuals. My name is Dr. Ebonee Williams. I'm from Oakland, California. I'm a first-gen student, as we talk about in the world today. I have degrees in chemical engineering and a master's in industrial business management. There was a time I was fluent in French. My PhD in chemical engineering, my expertise was polymer composites, and that was out of aerospace engineering up at University of Washington. I did my undergrad at Brown University. Yes, I'm giving this to you all out of order, but you'll be okay because you're smart and brilliant. And I've been at UCSD for over 15 years now. I came down to San Diego after I finished my PhD, and I have continued to thrive at UC San Diego, playing several different roles and engaging. When I finished grad school, the biggest thing I was excited about was growing other individuals. And so I participated in several other programs and played there. As people learned I had a PhD in chemical engineering, I couldn't hide anymore. So I got engaged with teaching. I did not get back engaged with research in an official capacity. I have a few friends I sneak in their lab and they let me play and talk to their grad students, as I've not enjoyed the idea of consistent writing for research grants, but I appreciate and respect all my colleagues who do that work. And from there, I ended up back in the School of Engineering after doing some experiential education and graduate student support work. I.e. learn by doing, I think is very important in the world of STEM. It's very important in the world of inclusive excellence. I.e. there's a lot of different learning styles that are out there, and that was really important to me. I got caught into leadership because I felt like if I influenced the leaders, then I could change the culture that would allow for more acceptance and diverse thinking so that we could have more excellent solutions. And I just recently was an interim assistant vice chancellor for student retention and success. Student success has always been at the forefront of my enjoy having people be the best version of themselves. And now I get to creatively play in the world of virtual experience and peer engagement initiatives. And what does that mean? Universities won't be the same after this, in the sense that virtual environment will be incorporated into what we do. What level of incorporation will vary. And so I get to play a role at UC San Diego to look at what that means early on, to sort of set some best practices and hopefully standards on how we create the community of care in that way. And the peer engagement initiative is looking at mentoring and culture shift. So how do we support each other? And I'm always playing with leadership. So that was a very quick summary of a very long life. And I look forward to sharing more as we answer more questions. I want to make sure I leave time for everyone else on the panel, but thank you for having me, and happy to be here.
Excellent, and thank you so much. As you talk about, pivoting over into virtual spaces here, I had to actually turn off my camera so I can make sure I have enough Wi-Fi to sustain myself on here. So please excuse me. Our next panelist here I'd like to introduce is Dr. Aj Hinton Jr. Aj, if you could please introduce yourself and tell us how you got to where you're at.
So my name's Aj Hinton Jr., but most people call me AJ or Dr. AJ. So I'm at the University of Iowa currently. I'm the Academic and Career Development Instructor at Iowa in the Diversity Inclusion Office. I'm also a postdoc associate in Dr. Edel Abel's lab, who's the chair of the Department in Internal Medicine and the Diabetes Director. And I also am I know I sounds like I do too many things, but I'm also adjunct at Winston-Salem State, and then also a fellow at Mayo. So it's a lot going on, but it's something that's fun to do. So then let's backtrack a little bit. So I got my undergraduate degree from Winston-Salem State. I'm very proud of being a RAM and getting my BS degree in biology from there and a minor in chemistry. Then I matriculated into a postbac program at Baylor College of Medicine, and I enjoyed it so much I decided to stay to do my PhD there. And I got my PhD in integrative and molecular and biomedical sciences there. And then I met my current boss at a conference that was at the Endocrine Society, and he convinced me that his lab was the right place to be. And at first I thought I was going to be in Utah because he was at Utah, and then he transitioned like 1 or 2 years before leaving before I left out of grad school to Iowa. So I was thinking about snowing and being able to ski and beautiful sightseeing, but Iowa actually has turned out to be really fun as well. And that's kind of like my story in a nutshell. What I focus on as far as research, I look at mitochondrial dynamics. So inside of our tissues, we have a lot of mitochondria. And what's fascinating is that they don't function individually, but they function as a network, kind of like a mesh. If you're looking at a net from a soccer field, or, I guess like a blanket, But what's interesting about this network is that with time, aging causes mutations that lead to mitochondria to become smaller. And one of these proteins that have been either mutated or downregulated is called OPA1. And so I study a protein called OPA1, is optic atrophy 1. And when we delete it in skeletal muscle, we see that it has aberrant effects. And these aberrant effects cause for miscommunication between two organelles, the mitochondria and the ER. And this space is called the mitochondrial associated membrane. And so I specifically study what happens when you delete mitochondrial proteins or have truncations in these proteins that translate into proteins, how they communicate differently between the mitochondria and the ER. And why is that important? Is because that when you age with diabetes and other cardiovascular related diseases, you actually have miscommunication in your MAM region, which is the mitochondrial associated membrane. So studying this space, we may be able to develop a molecular target of interest or early therapy that may modulate how the MAM activity changes in those regions, which could protect against diabetes or cardiovascular disease. So, and my diversity inclusion work, I'm all over the place. I love just doing everything. There's too many things to think about, but I try to promote Black and brown people, especially in STEM. Those are like my areas that I focus on, but I'm all about promoting all BIPOCs. I'll switch over to somebody else because I don't want to talk about diversity forever, because I will. So I'm very passionate about that just as much as my research. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Hinton. I definitely see the passion for the research coming through it. So we're excited to engage in further conversation about this topic of social consciousness. Our next panelist is Dr. George Boggs. Dr. George Boggs, would you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, thanks, Beto, and hello, everyone. I'm glad to be with you. So I'm also a first-generation college student. I grew up in northeastern Ohio and graduated from Ohio State with a bachelor's degree in chemistry. Then went to the University of California at Santa Barbara to get my master's in chemistry and began a teaching career, teaching chemistry in the community college. I got my PhD in higher ed administration from the University of Texas at Austin, and became president of Palomar College. I was president of that institution for over 15 years. It's about a 25,000 student community college in San Diego County. Then I was president of the American Association of Community Colleges in Washington, D.C. for a little over 10 years. That's the major advocacy group for the nation's community colleges and students. I've served on a number of committees and boards for the National Science Foundation and the National Academy of Sciences, and in particular in that work was very concerned about promoting opportunities for women and for students of color in STEM disciplines. Our last publication before I left the board was a publication called Barriers and Opportunities in STEM. So that's one of my passions, is to ensure that the doors are open for opportunity for every student in STEM careers. So that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boggs, and for the reminder of those barriers and opportunities. I think now that really resonates with everybody as we think about everything that we can't do because of COVID. We also are presented with many opportunities at the same time. So thank you. We look forward to talking a little bit more about some of those barriers and some of those opportunities. Our next panelist is Valeria Guerrero. Valeria, would you introduce yourself, please, and tell us what are you doing today?
Yes, of course. Can you hear me fine? Oh, there you go.
Absolutely.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Beto, for the invitation. My name is Valeria Guerrero, and I was born and raised in Mexico. And at age 16, we were under a very violent scene in Mexico. This is when the drug cartels were going on. And so it was a scary scenario for our family. So we moved to California. And in that immigration, we came with tourist visas and became undocumented eventually. And we came to reunite with our family. And the reason why I say this is because this really impacted where I am today. When I went to community college and realized, okay, now I gotta learn English. Now I gotta catch up with my peers so I can go to college. I realized it wasn't gonna be an easy task, and I was fortunate to end up at Contra Costa College for community college and find amazing mentors, amazing professors who saw my interest and I guess talent for mathematics. So they really encouraged me to pursue engineering, and I chose mechanical because I didn't know which one, and that seemed really broad, so I figured I'll figure it out later. And so I worked really hard because I found out that not only was I undocumented, but also I didn't qualify for any financial aid, not even the California Dream Act, which is financial aid for undocumented students here in California. So I had to figure it out, right? And applying to scholarships became my second job during community college, really my main job. And I was able to completely fund my education and also to earn a full ride scholarship to Santa Clara University so that I could pursue my bachelor's in mechanical engineering. And that opened up so many opportunities for me. And the reason why I say this is because sometimes we have this idea that those options are not out there, but they are. And now that I finished my bachelor's in mechanical engineering in 2018, I continue to study robotics and mechatronics. So I will be finishing my master's next year. And meanwhile, I started a side business where I offer my engineering services as a consultant, since this is a possibility for those of us who don't have DACA, who don't have a work permit, and are still ambitious and want to practice our passion. For me, it's making things. I love manufacturing. So I offer my services on the side, and right now I'm working with a startup here in the Silicon Valley where we build robots to separate trash. So it's really exciting work, and right now I'm in a really tiny room with a bunch of robots around me. I hope you can withstand the echo here, but yeah, this is where I'm at right now. Very excited to share my lessons along the way.
Wow, thank you, Valeria. Very exciting things happening, and thank you for sharing such intimate details about your journey so far. Our next speaker is Robin Lopez. Robin, would you let us know what are you doing? What are you doing, and what are you up to these days?
How's it going, everybody? Beto, thank you for the introduction and the invite. I don't know how to follow up on all the previous speakers and their introductions. I think they pretty much gassed me out of this, but I'll try. Also, shout out to Ebonee. I heard you're from Oakland. That's what's up. I was born in Oakland, raised in Richmond. I've been in the Bay Area all my life. I did not have the most straightforward academic path, and I'm sharing this in complete transparency for anyone who's out there who may be having second guesses about their abilities or opportunities. Don't doubt yourself. You have that passion, then you'll find the mentors who will help activate that. So I went to did my education throughout the Bay Area. To backtrack slightly, I actually barely graduated high school. As a teenager, I was in and out of trouble, had my hands in a lot of unnecessary things. You might hear some background noise right now. I got a squad of tiny humans at my house right now. And tangential, but unfortunately a family member had passed away yesterday. And so all the family's here. And I did have a moment in which I was considering texting Beto and not participating in the panel because of everything that's happening. But I felt I owe it to my grandmother and to my ancestors and all my elders to be here to express what they have worked so hard for me to be in this situation and to share that insight and that information. And so, yeah, and that intersects with what I was just talking about being in and out of trouble, barely graduating high school, not taking education seriously. And that's not a fault of my own. That's not a fault of my family. That is a fault of the system. That the system, the K through 12 educational system, does not provide enough resources and support for students from very specific backgrounds. Our country is known for just having a very generalized, broad framework for what education should look like. And typically that framework is with white folks in mind. It doesn't take into account very specific pedagogy that's needed for people from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities. So that said, when I tried to go to college, I dropped out like 4 times. I just couldn't figure it out. I just was not programmed to understand what the language was in college. Very similar to what Ebonee alluded to in the very beginning about learning the language of leadership. Just learning the language of academia was a challenge in itself. But unfortunately, the passing of one of my best friends who had died by suicide, that was the catalyst for my change, which made me go back to community college and really take it seriously. And I ended up realizing like I'm really good with numbers. Like I always knew I was good with numbers, like, counting money in other situations, but I didn't think that would apply to calculus. And so I was like, maybe I'll mess around and get an engineering degree. And so I ended up really loving my time at community college. Valeria and I, we went to the same community college, Contra Costa, and yeah, woo woo. And so it was from that experience and the mentors that I was able to have the privilege of interacting with that I was able to find my voice and my identity and what my purpose is. And so that has led to me transferring to San Francisco State, where I got my bachelor's in civil engineering, realized that I suck at making bridges, and if my name's ever on a bridge, don't go on it. It's not safe. There's a completely horrible story behind that. No one got hurt. But aside from that, after SF State, I went to San Jose State to complete my master's in water resources engineering. Me foolishly did not think I got enough academics in my system yet and decided to go for my PhD. So that's how I ended up at UC Berkeley. A lot happened in between, but aside from academics, I've been working with the U.S. Department of Energy at the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs since 2012 as a researcher. Much of my professional work focuses on the intersections of water, soils, climate, and environmental racism, and how we can look at equity through a scientific lens. Similar to what AJ had said, you get me going on DEI work, I could go on for days. So I'll just leave it really briefly that I do work with a local nonprofit in my section called Metas. I'm the 4th and 5th grade educator for that program. My main goal is just to get a bunch of tiny humans woke. So when it's time for them to do what they want to do, they got the tools and resources to do it. Whether that involves college or not, that my goal isn't to force them all to go to college. My goal is to allow them to activate their full potential in whatever those endeavors may be. I'm highly involved in DEI committees within my workplace and at UC Berkeley, and I'm constantly advocating that we need to pay people for their time because unfortunately, time and time again, it is the unpaid labor of Black and brown folks that push the needle for change in these institutions and trying to address institutional and structural racism. I think that's a good way to end off my introduction.
Excellent, thank you, Robbie, and please, I couldn't extend our condolences enough for the loss of your loved one, and we thank you for sacrificing the time to be with us this afternoon. So our condolences and our love. I also did notice that I didn't know how to take it right now, Robbie, that you said, we gotta pay our brothers and sisters, right? Because none of y'all are getting paid to be here. Y'all are volunteering today. But I want to thank you wholeheartedly for participating as we engage in this very sensitive topic, right? As you turn on the news and all we have the tendency to hear is bad news, right? If it isn't COVID, it's social unrest because of murders of Black and brown communities, of atrocious behavior with children in immigration centers and facilities, and really, that's kind of the purpose of why we're bringing all of you together with your individual lenses, right? With your individual backgrounds and knowledge, as administrators, as students, as beings, right? And what I really want to tap into is it's easy for us to formulate, a sense of social consciousness through memes, through gifs, through reposts and shares, right? But it's also important that we are able to personally define what social consciousness means to us, right? So I think that's where I'd like to go next is really find out, how do you individually define what social consciousness is? What is social consciousness to you all? And so maybe we could start with Ebonee on that one.
I see how this is gonna go. I'm gonna be first every time. I understand.
I'm gonna throw you off. I'm gonna throw you off.
That's all good, Beto. I am prepared and happy to be here. I do have to tell Robin, you can't start your speech off with throwing yourself under the bus. You're here because you have your own light. So don't do that no more, okay? Please, as a request. As far as social consciousness goes, in particular, as a scientist, social consciousness for me in the world of science, the reason I'm putting the world of science on there is I call myself a 5-part minority, and one of them is being an engineer. They definitively have us think differently than the rest of the world, or you could say being a PhD educated individual. And so from a scientific mind, social consciousness is a moment where you are aware that the way you see the world is not the way everyone else sees the world, right? Common sense is not common sense. There is very little, if anything, that is common other than that we would all like to thrive. We'd all like to be safe. We'd all like to be heard and understood. But when it comes to social consciousness, it's how do you account for the different journeys, finding the similarities, but also respecting the differences and sitting in the uncomfort of the fact that everyone may not agree with you, and knowing when you need to push because your perspective is going to be pertinent and influential in making a difference in the world. And that is hard when you can be seen as a part of one of the marginalized communities to always want everyone to always understand or agree with everything you say. But a social consciousness, even from that perspective, is understanding when to step back and like, that's just, we can agree to disagree, right? And be okay with that. And so social consciousness is understanding that the way that we're taught science is not the only way to understand science. One of the ways that was really thriving for me in my career and journey is when I discovered I could go get a different book than the teacher prescribed on the syllabus to understand the same material. Like that was the best awakening I've ever had in my life, right? I told you I went to Brown undergrad. I did my organic chemistry class, which was required for us chemical engineers at UC Berkeley over a summer, taking the final on my birthday. And I passed that class because my TA was also a chemical engineer and understood that I thought visually, so words didn't work for me. And so they found an animated book. Well, he was using an animated book to understand organic chemistry, and he shared that with me, right? And so social consciousness isn't just about race. It's not just about socioeconomic status. For me, the most fundamental basis of social consciousness is understanding that we all have lenses that have described how we see the world, and where we can see alignment is a gift, and where we can learn discernment to not force others to have to agree with us lends to a new space of awakening. And when it comes to the sciences, just because I know we're talking a little bit about STEM today, is there's different styles of learning, different styles of absorbing, and different perspectives. My teacher in geometry told me they always graded my paper last because my proofs I always did differently than everyone else in the class. They were correct, but how many teachers take the time to allow for us to have that divergent thought that isn't aligned with the only way they may have taught it or the only way that it's seen in the book, right? So I'm trying to say a lot in a short period of time to allow some of the other panelists to join in, but in the end, that is my perspective on social consciousness, right? Understanding yourself to understand that you are unique in your creation, and then what does that mean in connecting with others, and how do you work to understand others without diluting the fact that your perspective is needed in the world in order for us to move forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing that. You know, you bring up a lot of great points in talking about social consciousness with the lens of STEM. I'm interested to know if any of the other panelists would like to elaborate maybe on their definition of social consciousness without the STEM, right? What would social consciousness mean without STEM?
So I guess I'll go next. So just in general, social consciousness is more about a thought process or the morality of individuals that are collectively doing some process or engagement in some type of work. So what does that mean in the context of just society? If you think about the morality of individuals, we're all blessed with having our own innate set of skills, but we all have inside our understanding of what's right and wrong. So right and wrong is a process that each of us think about, and it's based upon the decorum that we've embodied from our ancestors, our relatives, our current individuals that communicate with us on a regular day basis. So in this kind of context, it's also needed to know that everybody's social consciousness is not the same standard, right? Mm-hmm. So the question becomes really not only what is social consciousness, but what is social consciousness in the form of society, and whether or not society has its own morality in the context of thinking about BIPOCs, Or is it only thinking about the agenda of creating imbalance, of power? So in my case, I believe that there are imbalances on both sides. I do believe that there are injustices within morality amongst BIPOCs, as well as the morality against what's going on in the oppression of, halting creative thought process. So what does that look like in the context of the BIPOC? I believe that BIPOCs sometimes hamper their ability to grow because they are so worried about how they can be seen as the model minority individually based upon a tokenism or stereotype threat principle. So in other words, I believe that we have to be careful about, as BIPOCs, that we have our own social consciousness, but what does that mean in the context of how we treat others inside of our own structure? So a good example of that is like in the Caribbean versus being African or being African American or being biracial, all from somewhere in the African diaspora. And then that also includes the same issues within colorism within Latin America as well. So for example, let's say if you are Mexican American, it's okay to be mestizo, but it's not okay to necessarily be like Afro-Mexican, correct? So that's even a smaller population near Oaxaca and other places that are near the southern region. But the point that I'm making is that we all have to think about what we can do to better our communities, not based upon the things that would hamper us to grow, but create a morality that is more inclusive in the context of not focus on skin color, but actually appreciating diversity of thought and why those cultural experiences or traditions may be different, but they actually embody who you are as a person that's a BIPOC. I also believe that we do have some social consciousness in the form of what social consciousness should look like as far as mainstream society goes, based upon the media, based upon the books and the textbooks that we look at, and then also from the humanities courses that we're enriched in on a daily basis as we go through society. So I believe that we all have to be careful about how we think, not to think like the collective sometimes, but actually think like an individual to come up with more inclusive points that actually could be drawn together to make a brighter future. And the last point I will make is, please don't think of social consciousness only in the form of color or society as a whole or morality, but also think about as that individual in the form of you. So think about emotional intelligence as a way to actually empower your social consciousness to change. So basically observing people's nonverbal as well as verbal communication will actually impact how you can actually have a better conversation with someone and know what you can and cannot say with the individual. Because some people's morality will never change. It's just the way that they're innately brought up. So we have to learn to accept that, and we have to be able to be strategic and move around that so that we can still function as a collective within society, and then a collective in STEM, and then a collective as BIPOCs and in our individual groups. So that's what I have to say.
Excellent. Wow. Thank you for sharing that, AJ. It really brings a lot of things to mind. First and foremost, that it seems we all have a lot of work to do, right? We all have a lot of work to do individually and socially, and it really lends itself, your statement lends itself to a theme that Dr. Boggs brought up earlier, where we're talking about barriers and opportunities. And so I'm curious to find out, Dr. Boggs, if, how do you see this interface kind of coming together? Have we taken into account many of the things that are going on around us in the world? Sentiments of anti-Blackness. We're talking about systemic issues that are happening in education, poverty, mass incarceration, all these different types of things. In your years as an educator, how do you see the interface kind of coming about with all these, the social consciousness and reality of all these pressing issues, and the ability for folks to continue to push through and persist in higher education and specifically in STEM?
Well, thanks, Beto. There are a few things that come to mind for me when thinking about social consciousness, and in particular, the intersection of STEM and social consciousness. The first is that it's important for STEM professionals to realize that their work, their research and implementation has a societal impact. It can be positive or it can be negative, and we need to be aware of that. We can't just be blindly doing our research or building our bridges or whatever we do without realizing what that impact is going to be, positive or negative. The second thing is I think all of us in STEM in particular need to confront misinformation, misinterpretations, conspiracy theories. And of course, the latest ones that we can think of are these wacko cures for the coronavirus, or the anti-vaxxers saying that vaccinations cause certain diseases, or climate change. You can think of many misconceptions or conspiracy theories that are out there. And for us, especially us in STEM, it's important for us to have the courage to speak out. We can't just hide in our laboratories and in our work, and not speak out for societal impact. And the other, Beto, is that we should mentor others and help others to realize the opportunities that can be had in a STEM career, or whatever the person may want to go into. We can't let people assume because they are a particular gender or a particular race or ethnicity that that career is not meant for them. We have to open those doors for them. And a lot of research has shown that the most important factor in a person pursuing a career is a mentor or a coach, a person who cared about them and helped them, help to open the doors and give them the encouragement to continue. So those are a few things that come to mind to me on talking about the intersection between STEM and social consciousness.
Excellent, thank you. You know, I'm also curious to see, you know, we've heard diversity, we've heard equity, we've heard inclusion, and you know, those words, right? And for some, they're just kind of words that we throw around, right? But there's a real intention when we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts might be on how that relates to this specific conversation. Robin, would you care to chime in on that?
Yes, most definitely. So along the same conversations of social consciousness, we, you know, others have already touched on this, that we need to also be aware of what others think and feel and interpret. And the westernized definition of consciousness deals with this notion of being awake and being aware of your surroundings. And for someone like myself, I think it's much more deeper than that, much more nuanced than that. So when we start getting into these specific terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to remember that those words have different meanings for different people. For me, my sense of inclusion is very different from, so let me back up. For me, as a straight male, my sense of inclusion is very different for someone who may identify as transgender. Because there are things that I do not quickly recognize or readily see, because that is not my experience. And so that's what I mean when it goes hand in hand with this idea of consciousness, being aware of what other people's experiences are. But you have to be more than aware. You have to be willing to listen. You have to be willing to have that agency to hold space. You have to be able to set aside your own pride and use your privileges to allow someone else the ability to have their own agency. We need to all work on our collective effort, and this is, you know, similar to what George had mentioned, in being advocates and being champions for that change. And so, you know, when we do hear these words, diversity, equity, inclusion, accountability, justice, liberation, those are very powerful words. And when things come with power, unfortunately, those who come across those tools like to weaponize them. And this is something we all need to be cognizant about. And again, this is where the consciousness comes into play. If we're on DEI committees and we see people who are kind of sitting there straddling on the sidelines and the fence, and they're just kind of there learning the term, we need to critically engage them and find out what they're about and why they're on this committee. Because I've seen time and time again, people who sit on DEI committees and claim that they're champions for change, but then they weaponize those exact same words against us. And when I say us, I refer to those of the many marginalized identities. So, in a nutshell, when we think of the term, for me, it has a very different meaning for the next person. And so, to put it, maybe concisely, for me, like the idea of diversity is more than gender, it's more than culture, it's more than ethnicity. And George was just talking about this, that, it's also this idea of thought. Someone's banging on the door. So I guess my time.
That might be opportunity knocking.
Yeah, I'll be right back and I'll pass the mic.
That's right. Thank you, Robin. And by the way, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, just in case you weren't familiar with the term, just wanted to make sure that you become familiarized with it. Robin really touched on some very important things, right? And I'm going to switch gears for a minute here on this conversation because we are pressed for time, and I want to make sure we get some skin in the game, right? And so I'm going to switch gears, and I'm going to go over to Valeria right now. And really, when I thought of this social consciousness in STEM, I was thinking the climate around us. I was thinking Black Lives Matter. I was thinking immigration. I was thinking, as a formerly incarcerated person myself, coming from these backgrounds, right? Where maybe before we get to campus to be a grad student, before we get to campus being the doctor that we are, we might get pulled over, or we might be afraid that we would get deported, or we might be afraid that I might fit the identity, right? Fit the description. I'm curious to know if any of you have dealt with these issues that we continuously see on the news, maybe not you directly, but a family member. And what does that look like for you, having to deal with that type of trauma, because that's really what it is, and still having to show up in these spaces where you're underrepresented already, you're already othered in there. And how do you navigate that space? Dealing with these traumas and going through a space where maybe you're the first generation there. Valeria, would you mind sharing or touching a little bit on that, if you can relate?
Of course. Thank you, Beto. And totally agree. I mean, imposter syndrome is a real thing. I first heard about this in a Chicana Latina Foundation scholarship meeting that we had, and pretty much what they explained to us is it tends to be those folks that excel, that are doing really well in their field, in their career of choice, that have this feeling of imposter syndrome when they're in these spaces and they're underrepresented, and somehow they feel like they're in this position out of luck. They didn't really earn this, and they're somehow tricking other people. They don't really know your background. They don't really know that you're successful because somebody gave you this opportunity. If it wasn't for that person, and then getting all the credit of your hard work out of the question. And I totally relate to that. I mean, it happens to me every day. The company I am working with at the moment, I am the only female in the technical team out of 2, and we're in total about 15 to 20 people, and it's growing rapidly. Same thing I saw in my bachelor's, my class of I think 200 people in the mechanical engineering class. There were a few ladies, but I was the only one that spoke Spanish, and that's 100, 200 people class, right? And so to me, it was a little bit difficult to feel that I had earned a position, and somehow I was thinking, oh no, I don't know, this school probably needed some diversity numbers, and that's why they accepted me versus the 4.0 GPA that I had, right? Yeah, I often feel that way, totally relate. And when I'm in these spaces and when I'm getting ready, sometimes I had to question twice. Do I wear these Mexican earrings? And I don't know if I want to talk about where they come from, and maybe we're going to talk about my background and maybe whether I'm from here, versus, okay, I'm just going to wear these really normal earrings. It's something that's so insignificant, right? That I question about every day. Do I come as my full self, who is an undocumented immigrant that is an engineer, or do I come as an engineer? And sometimes I think it's easier in these spaces in STEM because we're not having these discussions. We're talking about pressure gauges, or we're talking about metals. We're not talking about the issues out and the border sometimes, right? And so I think it's easy to dismiss these conversations, but not for folks like, in my case, it's not that easy. I think about this constantly, right? Mostly because I work with a lot of international people that were granted visas to work here. And then when we're talking about their visas, and then they ask me where I'm from, and there's this dilemma happening in my head, like do I tell them? Do I not? Who can I trust? I totally agree, Beto. I totally feel the same way. And it's this question, can I be myself? Can I fully disclose my identity and educate others, or expose them to what's happening out in the world, because I kind of represent that immigration situation happening, right? Or do I just keep that out, close myself, and I just do my work? It's a constant battle, I think, for me. But yeah, the fear of being deported definitely happens. I don't know who I can trust sometimes, right? So yeah, I would love to hear from the other panelists how you feel about this, but it's a real thing, and I feel you if you're feeling the same way.
Yeah, thank you for your willing to be vulnerable with us. You know, it's, man, I think this conversation is easily connected also to privilege, right? In that sometimes we, you know, as you're talking, I couldn't imagine what it feels like to be worried about that specifically, because I don't have to, right? And I think it's easy for us to be dismissive of the experiences of folks that are, in that case, undocumented, because we don't have to worry about that. But it's a reality for you, right? It's a reality. In the same way that I think it's also fair for us when we have conversations about race to, you know, we have the tendency to kind of connect, you know, whiteness to privilege, right? And also forget about, you know, the small percentage of folks who are really poor and don't have that access to resource and privilege, and kind of tend to clump folks up all the time, right? In the same way that communities of color are oftentimes clumped up, you know, in derogatory fashions at times. And so I also wanna take a moment to kind of talk about what that means, right? You know, if we have Dr. Boggs here, who's obviously white, right, and is a big champion for folks in communities of color and underrepresented students. And so, Dr. Boggs, if you wouldn't mind me asking, you know, what does it feel like to be, you know, to be yourself in spaces where we're having heavy conversations like these, right? Where we're constantly talking about systemic racism, we're talking about, you know, negative sentiment about certain groups. And what does that look like for you to continue to try to be a champion for folks?
Well, I think you have to have some empathy and some understanding. Beto, you know that I teach doctoral students at San Diego State and at Kansas State University. And most of my students are students of color, and I want to do everything I can to help them. By just listening to the speakers here brings up another point, and that is, I think that we in STEM need to be more politically active. We tend to shy away from this and stay in our realm in science, technology, engineering, and math. But we need to get out there and vote and encourage others to vote. Right after the last national election, I was teaching a class in Corpus Christi, Texas, and most of my students were students of color, and a lot of them hadn't bothered to vote. So we need to make sure people understand how important it is to engage in the political process, to encourage everyone to vote and speak out politically, to help people who are in these vulnerable positions, to help them and help our country to be more open. And it's a critical time, as you pointed out, Beto, that we have a lot of racial tension right now. We have the Black Lives Matter. We have the white supremacists marching. We have the the DACA students feeling insecure. So it's a critical time for us to speak out and do the right thing.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. You know, that kind of was a segue to what the next question for me was before I wanted to take a moment and make sure we entertained any questions from the audience. But how can we as individuals leverage our status or our background or our privilege to build more inclusive environments? Maybe AJ, would you start us off with that?
I can. So, so it's very interesting to use your privilege. So first, I guess we should define what privilege is in the context of being a BIPOC. So if we think about our educational status, people that have acquired at least a bachelor's degree, you are privileged. If you have not acquired a bachelor's degree but had community college, you are still privileged. If you have a master's degree or a PhD, you are very privileged. So now that you think about the opportunity for economic growth and empowerment, now you have the ability to do that at a greater rate than the people that are already in your community that do not. So now, first, now that we kind of have that clear out of the air, you do have some privilege more so than what you may have ever thought before. Now, the other part is that you also have privilege to actually have an excuse when you are leaving the institution and you may get stopped, or if you are out in the public, you have a kind of some protection. You can say, oh, I'm at University of California, San Diego, or I'm at University of Iowa, wherever it was the hometown. You can say, oh, I have this badge, sure, even if you didn't, the rule is, you came from where, you just came from work. So you always kind of have some level of protection that other people may not. So you have to be kind of aware of those instances, so that's the first thing. Now, how do we change that and help other people to come in? We're talking about the context of the pipeline. So where you're at, in each of our careers, there's a stage where you have to transition, right? So for me, like I'm transitioning to faculty, I'm doing interviews, but not everyone is privileged enough to be able to have multiple interviews or even let alone one interview to transition to faculty. So how can we create better opportunities for that particular set of people that are postdocs? Well, that's why I work in the diversity office to try to do things related to empowering postdocs to be able to have better career development opportunities. At the graduate level, being involved not only in just diversity related clubs, but also the organization as a whole, as a graduate student body, will actually affect more change. Things that you can actually do in your community is actually right now, you can participate in e-learning, set up something that, works with the local community colleges and actually inspire people that are transitioning into the bachelor's degree. So you actually can teach them related to tutoring online. You can actually teach them about certain scientific experiments that they may not have exposure to. And then the most critical piece is the K through 12. So actually developing Saturday morning sciences with groups of people, or even a consulting club where you can go to the community, empower them with the right resources, and actually champion for your institution. So now, how do you leverage funding? If you don't have funding to do these things, actually working with the diversity office or other entities that may be willing to fund your initiatives in the community will empower you to be able to create more change. When you're thinking about the pipeline, the pipeline is leaky. It has got some of us through. So you can't think of it in the context that it's broken, but there are places where we can patch up to make sure that others get through. And so I would say and suggest that these are the areas that I think that you could do to kind of make a positive change immediately. And the most important thing is to be reflective daily and have more mindfulness of yourself and your self-awareness about how you interact with other people. Because your I guess more or less your blueprint that you leave on people or your footprint that you leave on people is something that's important. Because if you don't have the right attitude or the understanding of how you can impact somebody by the words that you say, the words that you don't say, you could actually cause for people to actually be closed to the idea of actually elevating other people that are BIPOC or not. And in the context of creating a safe space does not only mean in the context for us, but also the thought of how other individuals that are allies are willing to help us. And so we have to bridge that gap to make sure that they're comfortable in this space so that they can actually continue to advocate for us and be sponsors for what we need. So this is what I just want to say.
Excellent. Really, really great points. I heard help folks see what they can be. I've heard be a lifelong learner. And I heard also that, having the being in tune with the fact that the people with the most access to resources and power might not necessarily look like you. So we have to continue to build environments where we can do a knowledge exchange, if you will. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to prompt everybody because I did want to do a time check. We're close to the end of this session. But if you did have questions, I'm going to ask you to put them in the chat, if you would. And meanwhile you're doing that, I wanted to give the opportunity to both Robin and Ebonee if you wanted to add something to this last question, which is how can you leverage your status, your background, and or your privilege as an individual, or maybe as through your role to build a more inclusive environment. Would either of you care to chime in on that?
Yes. I'm glad you asked. It's AJ hit some solid point that I want to build off of. This idea of our status and where we're at, it's important to remember that the titles that we have and the places that we're at, they don't define us, but that is what people see. So internally, I will say UC Berkeley doesn't define me. National Science Foundation Fellowship doesn't define me, but that's not always what other people see. And that's what, again, we're talking about the social consciousness in STEM. We need to be aware of that. And when we are aware of that, and when we're aware of the words, like what AJ was just saying, the words we're using and not using, we become more effective. And becoming more effective requires this use of the social capital that we have accumulated. All those ideas that AJ just beautifully put out as a framework for what we could be doing, we could easily do with the social capital that we've accumulated through our operating privileged spaces of academia. Valeria knows exactly what I'm talking about because she's also worked with me for that program that I teach for on the weekend called Metas. And we have leveraged our social capital to bring the science to the student, to allow them to interact. Beto, you were a previous guest speaker for the program, and you've seen how we operate in one of the most disadvantaged and under-resourced communities in the state of California, but have still found a way to support these students. So, there's that one point, like I said, of social capital and leveraging that, but also being reminding yourself that we need to be careful not to constantly center ourselves and center our emotion. And that's very important when we start elevating into these different positions of status and title, that we don't flaunt our title as something, or why we should be entitled to something, or why we should be entitled to have the floor to speak, and so forth. There are times when that's appropriate, such as when we're in a table full of folk that just don't get it, and we're the only ones that have that particular experience in the decision-making room. And then that's when we should be using that title to be like, hey, I have the expertise, I have the experience, and this is what needs to be said. But when it comes to mentorship and working with other scholars who are rising, we need to be cognizant of that. Ebonee, if you have anything further to add to that.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that. Ebonee?
Yeah, I'm not sure what else to add. You and AJ are killing it, but when it comes to leveraging a position, something that just keeps echoing in my mind, and I was really debating on if I could say it, but is defining yourself not to be a victim goes a long way. And we have so many stories and pieces that are associated with how we look physically on the outside, that we let those embed who we know ourselves to be on the inside. And so some of that is aligned with some of the imposter syndrome that was spoken to. Some of that is aligned with just how do you stand out. I mentor students on a regular basis, so I appreciate Professor Boggs for talking about mentorship and how important it is. And what I hear often is, well, I was the only one, the only woman, the only Black person, the only person who spoke Spanish, the only. But sometimes remembering the power you have in who you are as a being, You are on this planet to be yourself. And if you speak proudly in that space, that's how you leverage. Because you're in that space, someone can't use, for me, the N word, right? They may not be able to use a C word that I won't reference here, but, you know, I create a space for language to have to shift and inclusion to have to happen. And that is the role that some of us play, right? And that's leveraging where you are. Other things that I do, and I had to learn that this didn't work for my mentees, is I never introduce myself as Dr. Ebonee except for in these professional environments. And part of that is survival mechanisms as a Black woman. I like to know how you operate with me just as you see me. And then you find out that I'm the teacher of the class, or then you find out that I'm the one leading the project. But now you've already exposed your hand in how you respect or feel or work with someone who you see as me and what your assumptions are. But when I'm mentoring students, it's very important for them to know where I am and how that works and what I have overcome as a motivation for what's possible, as an alignment for values, as an alignment for vision. So understanding that some of the mechanisms we use in our own survival and our own techniques are not always what's going to be helpful in our mentoring and how the world sees us, I think is an important factor. And that goes into what AJ said around reflection and around self-understanding. And those are just the little pieces that I will add. And someone spoke about fear. I think there was a question about speaking towards fear in the world of being inclusive.
Would you like to address that? I was going to touch on that right now.
Go for it. And if I have something to add, I'll add it, right?
Yeah, no, I want to thank you very much for everything that you contributed to this last question, Ebonee. I wanted to do a quick time check. Excuse me. I know it's 4 o'clock and we are slated to end at 4 o'clock, but I did want to honor the 2 questions that did pop up. So if you have an extra 5 minutes or such, you know, and want to hang out, that'd be great. And if you can't, we totally understand that too. But I urged you to put in your questions, and 2 of you were brave enough to put them in there. So I want to make sure we address them if possible. And Sandeep asks if there was any comment on how fear plays in the exclusion of minority groups in the context of social conscious. And so I'm not sure. I guess there's a couple of ways that could be interpreted. Sandeep, if you're there, would you care to tell us verbally what your question is, more specifically?
Yeah, I would. What my question is, I feel like people who are in position of power and who have the privilege, I feel like they are afraid that if they uplift other people, they will end up losing their privilege to some extent. And that's what I'm trying to ask.
Excellent. Very, very good question. Very good question. Would you know, Ebonee or AJ or Dr. Boggs, would you like to address his question, or do you have anything to respond to that?
I'll just mention that I'm sure there are some people like that, but my belief has always been I gained strength by having more competent people around me. When I was president of a college, I wanted the very, very best people I could have as vice presidents and deans, because it made the college better and made my job easier. So I hope that that more leaders understand that they are not afraid of helping others. That only makes them better if they do.
Yeah, and what I was going to add to that, and thank you for the question, and I agree with what a panelist just said, is it's all about constructs of how you look at the world and value, right? If I have a gallon of water and I share my gallon of water with you, now I have less than a gallon. But do I need a whole gallon of water for my current existence is a question that people don't always think about. And so it's all about how you see power constructs and what that looks like. So there are people who may feel that way, and not may. We know that there are people who operate from that space. And then there's other positive ways to operate within that space. And so I think it's a matter of choosing and trying to identify those individuals that who are open to changing and seeing a new way, and those who already see a new way and are looking for ways to be proactive and collective. So
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Sandeep, I would just add to that real quick that, you know, being a leader isn't always easy, right? And it means that being a good leader is going to be a bold leader. And a bold leader is going to do things that are going to cause them to feel uncomfortable sometimes. But it's only through that discomfort that any growth is going to happen. It's only through that discomfort that leadership per se can really exist, right? Because it's going to lead to a whole new space and be able to break down doors and break down barriers for other folks to be able to take advantage of those opportunities that you were mentioning.
And I would like to say something right before my phone dies. So I wanted to say first, thanks everyone for having me, but I want to answer your question. So if you think about your question in the context of fear, what is fear? It's the understanding of not knowing, right? So you don't know something and you think that it's something that you need to know or that you have to acquire. But really, as a leader, you're supposed to bring out of you. So you're really supposed to dry yourself up. You're really supposed to give everything that you have as a leader, as a teacher, to other individuals to empower them to do better than you. And so the context of really of a master mentor or a teacher or a professor that's, you know, teaching research, they should empower the next generation to the point to where they're training them to take their place. That is how I train each one of my mentees. And that's why I feel like they're so successful, because I don't care if they pass me. I expect them to pass me. I expect even the postdocs that I train or people in the diversity office to not only think of me as like, man, he knows a lot of things, but he's willing to pour out all he has, right? And you do leave a little bit for yourself so you can, you know, come back to the table the next time to make even more change. But you really want to give all that you have at that moment, all that God's blessed you with that knowledge to be able to help others, then that's what you have to do. You have to be really open to changing who you are. And then I also wanted to comment on the technology thing because I have to go because I have another meeting and I got 1%, so I may cut out. But the point is, with technology, you have to think about social consciousness is that it's a algorithm. So the algorithm is changed by the people that control that infrastructure, right? So Facebook per se. So you have to create diversity within the technology infrastructures that are out there for social media in order for things to change. If you want facial recognition to work better in the context that people don't judge you based upon the color of your skin or what you look like, then you have to create the social construct that the algorithm must change. So that means the algorithm of the heart also has to change. How we think about people in the context of what we can do, because we don't know who we're impacting. We don't know if we're talking to a billionaire or a millionaire on the phone and may be able to sign us a check for our next philanthropy outreach or our next e-learning engagement. So you have to be careful about how you think about things and how you interact with other people. So that's all I wanted to say. And I really appreciate you guys having me on the panel. And God bless. And I'll see y'all later because I have to go to my other meeting. All right.
All right, AJ. Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Hi, AJ.
Bye.
So on this very last question here that we have is from Astrid, and she wanted to know, and kind of AJ touched on it, how does technology literacy factor into social consciousness? Astrid, did you want to say a little bit more about your question?
Okay, so in this context, it's how we need to have Wi-Fi, because one thing that struck me about the United States is how we're one of the least Wi-Fi enabled places in the world. And in that sense, when you don't have the internet, it's a lot less harder to reach your social capital or a means to lift others up in that way.
Interesting point. Any of the panelists want to touch on that? I think it's closely aligned to socioeconomics and technology gaps.
I could take a stab at this, Beto, because this is the question that I wrap my head around a lot with, especially in my community, because we are dealing with this. And the term that gets floated around a lot is digital equity. And this, to be honest, this wasn't something that I contextualized up until like maybe a couple years ago. And partly because of my ignorance and knowing what the right terminology and framing the issue was. But I became more aware of it, more in tune with it, because my partner had sat on a panel featuring several local high school students out of San Jose. And for those who aren't too familiar, San Jose is like the tech capital of Silicon Valley. And these students from Eastside San Jose were expressing their frustrations that they are having issues with digital equity. In one of the most supposed richest areas of technology in the world, we have this weird juxtaposition of wealth and access and then lack of wealth and access. Right there in San Jose, where we have the big tech hub like Google, Facebook, and LinkedIn and so forth. But we have students, and this was pre-COVID, students that were lining up on the weekends just to get work done in the school library because that was their only access to the internet. That was their only access to a computer. And so, I love that Astrid brought this up because this is something we all need to think about and put some more serious thought into it. I don't have the answers. I'm still, like I said, I'm still trying to wrestle with it. But now we're migrating to remote instruction, and it's not enough just for tech companies to say we'll set up Wi-Fi hotspot. We need much more than that, and so that goes hand in hand with the idea of pedagogy that's socially and culturally relevant, and how do we have effective teaching resources, and Astrid spot on with how do we leverage the social capital for those who don't have that access at their fingertip through Wi-Fi or computer. And so these are things that some of us as educators, we need to think about. We need to critically think about, because a college student, and I'm specifically saying college student because this is what we're mostly working with right now within the scope of this panel. A college student may have a laptop, may have Wi-Fi at home, but that does not mean they have the right environment to do their work or the necessary Wi-Fi bandwidth to do their work. You seen earlier, someone was banging on the door when I was speaking. That's because someone needed to use the bathroom. Like, that happened, that's life. But for other people, it's far much more worse than that. Like, I was listening in on stories where people were telling me they had to go to their neighbor's house to use the Wi-Fi, and they don't show their screen or share their screen because they don't want to put their neighbor's property in jeopardy or expose their neighbor's house. And so these are things we also need to think about when we talk about digital equity and this idea of trying to force students to show their faces on screen when we're doing synchronous lesson plans. So all these things, I mean, these are topics we need to have more conversations on. Like I said, I don't have the solution, but these are definitely the questions we need to start putting more serious consideration into.
Absolutely. Very, very, very good points. I think if at any point now we've seen that digital divide or the lack of access, I mean, it's definitely now where everything has kind of pivoted to this virtual platform. So yeah, absolutely. A lot of issues still to be addressed, a lot of socioeconomic issues, socio-emotional components that kind of come into play. And definitely the very, very reason why having conversations like these are necessary, so that we can all realize that we're not alone, that it's quote unquote normal. There's a sense of normalcy to the craziness that we live in, and that you can do what it is that you set out to do. All our panelists, we want to thank you very much for joining us today and participating in this engaging conversation. We thank you for your willingness to be transparent and authentic to us, with us. And for all those who have tuned in today, thank you very much for allowing us to be a part of your day. We thank you, and we hope that you'll join us on the next session, next installment of the Summer STEM series, which will be Women in STEM. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Feel free to reach out if you want to get in touch with some of our panelists, and be looking out for the recorded version of this video later on if you want to hear something one more time. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good one.
Thanks for having us,
Thanks,
Beto.
everyone.
It was
Absolutely.
nice to meet all the panelists.
Take care. Thank you all.